Okay, we're going to move on. So the next talk is me, and it's going to be the history of U.S. policing. Um, so before I get started, I just want to share some of the books that I used for my research. So the first one is Policing a Class Society by Sidney Herring, and you can find this at Haymarket. Another book I used is From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, literally my Bible. So if you have not read this, please get it. And then I also listened to some speeches. You can find some really revolutionary speeches on wearemany.org. And then I listened to Brian Bean's talk on there. So just wanted to share those. Okay, I'm going to get started. Um, an amazing organizer from the South by the name of Sherelle Brown said something in 2015 when Freddie Gray was murdered in Baltimore, and these words have stuck with me ever since. She said, "Do not let them call you violent with no critique of white supremacy and capitalism as violence." So that's what I plan to do, to critique these unchecked systems in power that continue to beat on and murder the working class people, especially Black, Brown, Indigenous, queer, and trans people. I plan to examine the history of the police in the United States and illustrate how the police, all 900,000 of them and growing, uphold systems that ensure the safety of the ruling class or the people at the top. That they exist for only three purposes, and all three purposes have nothing to do with keeping us safe. Number one, they patrol poor neighborhoods. Number two, they protect private property. And number three, they manage crowds. I hope to explain that they are not, in fact, part of the working class. I'll also review how neoliberalism demanded for a more brutal and violent police force, which is what we are seeing today on the streets. Even when police don't lead with violence, the threat of violence is always there. Police are not here for our safety, they are here to put profit over people. Police not only repress us, but they also regulate the working class by upholding the ideology of the working class. Those in power engineer class and racism, and the police discipline us accordingly. This is proven in the need for their creation. In just a few decades, between the 1820s and the 1850s, the modern police force was created. That's such a small amount of time. In both the North, the South, and even in the West, the police were created to control people. In the North, since capitalism was developing, workers, migrants, enslaved Africans, free Black people were all moving into urban areas for jobs. They found themselves in factories where they saw an increase in exploitation and a decrease in workers' autonomy. Police repressed rebellions, uprisings, and strikes that came from these labor changes. Capitalists, or the bosses, had too many workers in one space, and it was impossible for them to keep up with all of them. Crowds became unruly, and the police came in to shut things down in the name of the bosses. And as people were migrating to bigger cities, police were the most violent towards the poorest, and they were socializing them for labor discipline. This led to a division of people by skill and ethnic prejudice. So I think if we look at May Day, for example, which I think is so weird that we don't celebrate it in this country as big as other countries. Hundreds and thousands of working class people went on strike May 1st, 1886, to fight for the 8-hour workday and were met by police and armed forces that attacked and killed a lot of people. Not only were police used to repress people at work, but they were also there to terrorize folks at home. In Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, um, Keeanga Yamada Taylor explains that landlords fully exploited and segregated the housing market. Housing was already scarce in these fast growing urban areas as waves of migrants and Southern Blacks entered cities. Laws were written that enforced housing segregation. An example is when in 1917 in Chicago, Real Estate Board amended its bylaws to warn that it would discipline any real estate agent who introduced a minority resident into a racially homogenous neighborhood. It was the police upheld laws like these. The concentration and effects of Black poverty made it easier for constant police arrests and violence. In 1925, the police shot and killed 55 people just the first half of that year. So let's look at the South. So in the South, originally volunteer vigilante groups called alarmmen, searchers, and slave patrols were hired by plantation owners or the ruling class in the South because slave rebellions were becoming harder to control. In this process, the police became a modernized force in the South. Their job was to make sure enslaved Africans and freed Black Africans were part of the labor force. They stopped, frisked, monitored, arrested, and terrorized all of them. Urban cities were also developing in the South, and these urban cities needed a police force to strike down on Black people. As urban cities were developing in the South, enslaved Africans were hired out to private employers to maintain a Black labor force. At the same time, Black people were gaining autonomy, learning to read, becoming leaders in the church, creating community, doing things that were difficult to do on rural plantations. There was an immediate need to regulate and repress them, so the police used violence. Also, the first modern police force was the London Metropolitan Police Force, which was created in 1829, and it was to maintain colonial control of Ireland. And so the Boston Police, which was created in 1838, and the New York City Police, which was created in 1844, those were the first two police forces created in this country. But I bring this up to bring in colonialism and how wild it is that the police force can exist on stolen land, one, and that the first police force was created to steal land and colonize it, which I think we often forget about to talk about colonization when we talk about the police. And I think this leads to Indigenous people being more likely to be killed by law enforcement more than any other racial or ethnic group. And there's a reason that the police exert the most violence on Indigenous and Black people. As neoliberalism emerged in the 1970s, the police force evolved into something even more violent. In 1971, there were less than 200,000 people in prison. This number was increased by 700%, bringing the number to 2.4 million. These numbers coincided with a lack of economic process and huge social welfare cuts. Just from 2007 to 2012, white police killed at least 2 Black men a week. That is double the rate of lynchings at the height of Jim Crow. During the Clinton administration, the Pentagon was authorized to donate surplus military equipment to local police departments. In 2012, the military transferred a record of $546 million worth of property to local police departments. When Mike Brown, an 18-year-old Black young man, was murdered by Darren Wilson, a police officer, we saw military equipment in the streets of Ferguson, some of the same equipments that we see in Palestine today. Currently, $100 billion goes to police, $80 billion goes to prisons, and $5 billion goes to Border Patrol. Police protect private property, and you could look at Tucson as a perfect example. In downtown Tucson and on 4th Avenue, I often see houseless people and poor people being harassed by police. These cops police gentrifying neighborhoods that ultimately kick poor and working class people out in the name of city development. If capitalists want to steal land and put expensive apartments in the neighborhood, you better believe that the police help drive poor and working class people out and help bring people in who can afford the rent. As an organizer from Columbus, Ohio, Ruben Castilla Herrera said, rest in paradise, Ruben. He said, "The police are not here to protect me and my safety, they are here to remove me." Socially constructed status quos created by capitalists teach us that we should call the police for any type of emergency. But if the police are called and a person with a mental illness is involved, that person is 20 times more likely to be killed by a cop. And 3/4 of all homicides are done by someone we know. And if you are killed by someone you don't know, there's a 1/3 chance that it will be a cop. Working class people resist and fought back against ruling class status quo, and I promise you, it's guaranteed that you'll find the police violently repressing and killing us. Actions in Tucson by the police the past month have been disgusting, to say the least. And instead, um, instead of calling to defund the police or abolish the police, Mayor Romero um, put up a Black Lives Matter flyer on a federal building for Juneteenth. But in the past few weeks, we have found out that Tucson police, this progressive police force, hid two murders of two Latinx men in March and April, which is pretty disgusting to hide that and then to put up a Black Lives Matter flyer. Um, Police around the country have done the same thing. They've continued to repress riots and strikes. An example is in Standing Rock. On October 27, 2016, police maced, beat, and arrested 141 water protectors when they moved directly in the path of the Dakota Access Pipeline construction. A week later, another 130 protectors were arrested, and all in the name of capitalist private property. Once again, police said that protectors were violent, so society questioned the water protectors' intentions and never once critiqued police violence. The police uphold laws that protect against stealing, not starving, trespassing, not homelessness, and above all else, protecting private property, which is why they are not a part of the working class. If they continuously repress the work being done to liberate the working class, they are not me and I am not them. The median salary of a police officer in the United States is $51,000 compared to the household median of $41,000. They receive benefits from the state and even receive badges of honor. Bullshit. They often don't have to deal with the layoffs, retirement, reductions, and etc. that working class people have to deal with. The police are never policed, which is why they continue to kill and rarely be convicted. Sherry Wolf, an organizer in New York City, explains that whatever class police emerge from, once they put on that uniform, police must, regardless of personal conviction, act in the interests of the 1%. Cops must conform to cop think if they want to be trusted by everybody else. They are trained to treat everybody as a threat, and if they do not perform their job accordingly, they risk being left to hang dry. And there are not just a few bad apples. If that were true, why doesn't the media say this about the protesters who broke a few windows? There are no few bad apples because the good ones remain quiet about the bad ones. Because the ruling class are the only class allowed to use violence as a legitimate tactic and tool. And I think the ruling class know that this is bizarre. This is why they need police and armed forces to be protected and to uphold their lives. We must critique this at all times. The oppressed have every right to resist oppression, and we have every right to use violence. So do we need alternatives to police? Yes, but it can't come from nonprofits that have to rely on grant money received from mostly rich white people whose ideology is protected by the police. And I want to end by saying that we have no choice but to abolish the police, because even when we create alternatives to policing in our communities, cops will keep killing us. Cops just aren't out here killing people by mistake. And most of the time, there was no conflict for cops to even intervene when people are murdered. And the people who are killed by police literally were doing nothing wrong. As Brian Bean explains in his talk on We Are Many, he says, Mike Brown was just walking around. Tamir Rice and Rekia Boyd were just playing outside. Philando Castile, Wallace Scott, and Sandra Bland were pulled over for routine traffic stops. Alton Sterling was selling CDs. Freddie Gray just made eye contact with a cop. Stephon Clark was in his backyard. Breonna Taylor was sleeping. Tatiana Jefferson was playing video games in her home. And so we've all seen wins right now, and they've only come from taking the streets and questioning everything about the police. As we do this, we cannot let Democrats deter us from the true goal, which is to abolish the police. So fuck 12, and hopefully I will see all of y'all in meetings and in the streets. So solidarity.